It was just a wedding photo until you zoomed in on the bride's hand and discovered a dark secret. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Atlanta Historical Archive as Dr. Rebecca Morrison carefully examined a collection of early 20th century photographs donated by an anonymous estate among faded portraits and formal gatherings. One image stopped her cold. A wedding photograph from 1903. A white man in a dark three-piece suit sat rigidly beside a black woman in an elaborate white wedding gown. Their hands were clasped between them in what should have been a gesture of unity. Rebecca's 15 years as a historical archivist had taught her to notice anomalies. This photograph screamed wrongness on multiple levels. In 1903 Georgia, interracial marriage wasn't just taboo, it was illegal. The state's anti-miscegenation laws in place since 1750 and strengthened after the Civil War made such unions criminal offenses punishable by imprisonment. Yet, here was photographic evidence of what appeared to be exactly that. She marked the photograph for high-resolution scanning, unable to shake the unsettling feeling that gripped her. 2 weeks later, while reviewing the digital files, Rebecca systematically zoomed in on various details. The studio backdrop, the woman's jewelry, the man's stern expression. Then she focused on their joined hands. As she increased the magnification, her blood ran cold. The bride's fingers weren't simply resting. They were deliberately positioned in a distress signal, her thumb and index finger forming a subtle but unmistakable plea for help. Rebecca's hands trembled as she zoomed in further. The woman's fingers were arranged with clear intention, hidden within what appeared to be a matrimonial pose, but actually screaming for rescue. This wasn't just an illegal marriage. It was evidence of something far more sinister. A silent scream had been frozen in time for 120 years, waiting for someone to finally see it and understand what it meant. Rebecca immediately contacted Dr. Marcus Williams, a specialist in African American history and Jim Crow-era documentation. When he arrived at her office that evening, she showed him the photograph without explanation. Marcus studied it silently, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This shouldn't exist," he finally said. "Georgia's anti-miscegenation laws in 1903 made this impossible." Unless what? Rebecca asked, though she already feared the answer. Marcus leaned back, his face grim. Unless this wasn't actually a legal marriage. Unless this photograph documents something else entirely. Coercion, captivity, or worse. Look at her face. That's not a bride's expression. That's terror being barely contained. They spent hours examining every detail. The studio stamp read Morrison and Wright Portrait Studio, Atlanta, Georgia, August 1903. A faint notation on the back said only, "Mr. Charles Whitfield and servant, not wife, not bride, servant." The word hung between them like a curse. "He didn't even try to hide what she was to him," Marcus said quietly. "This photograph was never meant to document a marriage. It was meant to document ownership." Rebecca felt sick. But why the wedding dress? Why stage it this way? Marcus pulled up historical records on his laptop. Control, humiliation. Some white men during this period exercised their power over black women in unspeakable ways. They couldn't legally marry them, but they could still force them into situations that mimicked marriage. A grotesque parody that satisfied their desires while maintaining their social standing. The woman had no rights, no protection, no way out. That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She kept seeing the woman's face, her carefully positioned fingers, the silent scream that had echoed across more than a century. Who was she? What had happened to her? And most haunting of all, had anyone seen her signal at the time? Or had it remained invisible until this moment, and far too late to save her? The next morning, Rebecca and Marcus began their investigation at the Georgia State Archives. They needed to identify both people in the photograph. The name Charles Whitfield was their starting point. The archivist, an elderly black woman named Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, who had worked there for 35 years, visibly tensed when she heard the name. "Charles Whitfield," she repeated slowly. "That's a name that still carries weight in certain circles, though not the kind anyone should be proud of." She disappeared into the records room and returned with several boxes. The Whitfield family was prominent in Atlanta from the 1870s through the 1920s. They made their fortune in cotton and textiles after the war. Charles Whitfield inherited the family business in 1898. The 1900 census showed Charles Whitfield, age 28, living in a large house on Peachtree Street with substantial wealth and numerous servants listed in his household. Rebecca's stomach tightened as she read and through the names. All black women and girls, ages ranging from 14 to 30. One entry caught her attention. Louisa, age 16, domestic servant, literate. Marcus found property records showing that Whitfield owned several properties around Atlanta, including a textile factory where he employed dozens of workers, mostly black women and children, working in brutal conditions for minimal wages. Newspaper articles from the period praised him as a progressive employer and pillar of the community. The disconnect between his public image and what they were uncovering was nauseating. They searched for more information about the woman in the photograph. If she had been listed as servant rather than by name on the photo notation, finding her identity would be difficult. But Mrs. Hayes had an idea. If this photograph was taken in August 1903, check the city records for missing persons reports or unusual incidents around that time. Sometimes families tried to report when their daughters disappeared, even though the police rarely did anything about it. After 2 days of searching through fragmentary records, Marcus found a police report from September 1903. It was brief and dismissive, but it provided the first real clue. Report filed by Henry and Martha Johnson regarding their daughter, Louisa Johnson, age 19, employed in the household of Charles Whitfield. Family claims she's not been seen in over a month despite living just 2 miles away. Mr. Whitfield states Miss Johnson is fulfilling her contracted duties and is in good health. No evidence of wrongdoing. Case closed. Rebecca cross-referenced the name with the 1900 census. There she was, Louisa Johnson, age 16 in 1900, living with her parents and 3 younger siblings in a modest home near Auburn Avenue. Her father, Henry, worked as a carpenter. Her mother, Martha, as a laundress. The family was literate and owned their small home. They were part of Atlanta's striving black middle class, trying to build. And despite the crushing weight of Jim Crow, Marcus found more records. In 1902, Henry Johnson had been injured in an accident at a construction site and could no longer work. The family fell into debt. A notation in a local church's charity record showed they had appealed for help in early 1903. "This is how it happened," Marcus said, his voice heavy with anger and sorrow. Whitfield saw an opportunity, a family in desperate circumstances, a young woman with no options. He offered employment, probably promised good wages, and then they found a letter in the church records written by Martha Johnson to the pastor in July 1903. "We have not seen our Louisa in 3 weeks. Mr. Whitfield says she's well and working hard, but he will not let us visit her. He says it would disrupt the household routine. Reverend, my heart tells me something is wrong. My daughter writes to us every week without fail, but we have received no letters. When I went to his house, the servants would not look at me. Please, can you help us?" The pastor's response was noted in his journal. "Spoke with Mr. Whitfield regarding the Johnson girl. He assured me she is healthy and content, simply busy with her duties. He expressed annoyance at the family's concerns and suggested they are being ungrateful for his generosity in employing her. I'm inclined to believe him. The Johnsons must trust in God's providence and not make trouble for a prominent gentleman who has shown them Christian charity." Rebecca tracked down the Morrison and Wright portrait studio records through the Georgia Historical Society. The studio had operated from 1895 to 1910. And remarkably some materials had been preserved by the photographers' descendants. She contacted James Morrison, the great-grandson of William Morrison, the studio's founder. James invited them to his home in Decatur, where he maintained an extensive archive of his great-grandfather's work. William Morrison photographed Atlanta society for 15 years, and explained, leading them to his study. He kept detailed journals about his clients and his work. He was also quietly an abolitionist son who struggled with photographing the uglier aspects of Southern society. He pulled out a leather journal from August 1903. "I've read through all of these over the years. Some entries stayed with me. This is one of them." He opened to a page marked with a faded ribbon and began reading. August 17, 1903. "Today, I perform perhaps the most disturbing task of my career. Charles Whitfield commissioned a wedding portrait, but there was no wedding. The young Negro woman he brought to the studio was clearly not there of her own will. She wore an expensive gown that didn't fit properly, and her eyes held such profound fear that I'd nearly refused the commission." The entry continued. Whitfield insisted on posing them as a married couple with their hands joined. The woman, he never used her name, only called her girl, began to tremble when he grabbed her hand. I noticed bruising on her wrists as I positioned them for the photograph. When I looked into her eyes to ensure she was facing the camera properly, I saw a desperation there. She was trying to tell me something, but with Whitfield watching her every movement, she couldn't speak. James turned the page, his voice becoming strained. As I prepared the exposure, I noticed her fingers moving slightly, repositioning themselves into what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, a signal perhaps. I said nothing, but I made sure to capture it clearly. I took 3 exposures. Whitfield wanted to ensure he got a perfect image. After they left, I felt physically ill. I knew what I had photographed wasn't a wedding. It was evidence of something criminal. But what could I do? Report it to the police? They would laugh at me for suggesting a white man of Whitfield's standing had done anything wrong. Marcus expanded the investigation to examine Whitfield's history more comprehensively, and what they discovered was a pattern of exploitation that spanned years. Through court records, property documents, and newspaper archives, a disturbing picture emerged. Between 1899 and 1905, at least 6 families had filed complaints about daughters who had gone to work for Whitfield and subsequently disappeared from contact with their families. Each case followed a similar trajectory: a black family facing economic hardship, a young woman usually between 16 and 20 hired as domestic help, initial letters home that suddenly stopped, family members turned away when they tried to visit, police reports filed and immediately dismissed. In 2 cases, the young women eventually reappeared months later, refusing to speak about their experiences, their spirits visibly broken. Rebecca found testimony from a woman named Sarah, who had worked for Whitfield in 1901. She had given a statement to a black community organization documenting abuses by white employers, a record that existed outside canals because official channels refused to hear such complaints. "Mr. Whitfield kept 3 of us in the house," Sarah stated. "We were never allowed to leave. He told us if we tried he would have our families arrested for theft or our fathers lynched. He did whatever he wanted to us. We were his property and everything but name." The testimony continued. "There was a girl there when I arrived. Couldn't have been more than 16. She was in a room on the 3rd floor and we weren't allowed to speak to her. I heard her crying at night. After a few weeks, she disappeared. Mr. Whitfield said she had stolen from him and run away. But I knew better. She wouldn't have left. She was too afraid of what he would do to her family. I got out because my brother threatened to make noise to go to the newspapers. Whitfield let me go rather than risk attention, but I know others weren't so fortunate." Marcus found records showing that Whitfield had connections to local law enforcement and officials. He made regular donations to political campaigns and hosted social gatherings for Atlanta's elite. He had complete immunity, Marcus said bitterly. The system protected him. The police worked for him. The courts deferred to him. And black families had absolutely no recourse. Their daughters could be taken, abused, even killed, and there was nothing they could do about it. Despite the darkness of what they were uncovering, Rebecca remained focused on Louisa herself. The photograph showed more than victimization. It showed resistance. The hand signal captured forever in that image was an act of defiance, a refusal to let her captivity go unrecorded. She knew, Rebecca said, studying the photograph again. She knew that photograph might be the only evidence, so she left a message. Through Martha Johnson's letters to various organizations and churches, they traced the family's desperate attempts to find their daughter. In October 1903, Henry Johnson, despite his injuries, tried to force his way into Whitfield's house. He was arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace, spending 2 weeks in jail. The incident made the newspapers, but the coverage was entirely sympathetic to Whitfield. Prominent businessman harassed by deranged former employee's relative. Martha wrote to the NAACP's Atlanta chapter, newly formed in 1903. "My daughter is being held against her will by Charles Whitfield. She came to his home as an employee and is now his prisoner. I've not seen her in 4 months. She would never abandon her family voluntarily. Please, someone must help us. We have exhausted every legal avenue and no one will listen because we are Negro and he is white and wealthy. The NAACP responded, but their investigation hit the same walls. Their lawyer, a black man named Robert Foster, attempted to obtain a writ of habeas corpus. The judge refused to issue it, stating there was no evidence of illegal detention and suggesting the Johnson family was wild accusations against a respected member of society in an attempt to extort money. Foster documented the case, but could go no further without risking his own safety and career. Then Marcus found something unexpected. A letter dated December 1903 from a white woman named Eleanor Hartwell, who had been Whitfield's neighbor. She wrote to her sister in Boston, "There is something deeply troubling happening next door. Charles Whitfield has a young Negro woman in his house, whom he claims is a servant. The situation appears far more sinister. I have seen her only once looking out from an upper window. Her face was bruised. I attempted to speak with her when Charles was away, but the other servants refused to let me in, clearly frightened. I am considering reporting this to someone, but I fear no one will believe me or care." The trail of Louisa's story went cold after December 1903, and Rebecca feared the worst. But then Marcus found something in an unexpected place: the records of the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. In March 1904, a woman named Louisa had been admitted with severe injuries brought in by members of a black mutual aid society who had found her near the train station. The hospital records were sparse but revealing. Female patient, approximately 20 years of age. Gave name as Louisa but refused surname. Multiple injuries in various stages of healing, including broken ribs, lacerations, and signs of prolonged physical abuse. Patient extremely traumatized and barely speaks. Exhibits profound fear of men, especially white men. Patient has indicated she escaped from somewhere in Georgia, but will not provide details, stating, "He will kill my family if I tell." Rebecca's heart raced as she read further. The hospital had contacted a local organization that helped escaped women, both those fleeing slavery's remnants and those fleeing abusive situations. A social worker named Catherine Wells had taken responsibility for Louisa's case. Her notes provided more context. This young woman has been through unimaginable trauma. She flinches at sudden movements and has nightmares that wake the entire ward. Over several weeks, she has gradually shared pieces of her story: forced captivity, repeated assaults, isolation from her family, and constant threats against her loved ones if she attempted to escape. Catherine's notes from April 1904 recorded Louisa's words. "I was trapped in that house for 8 months. He took everything from me: my freedom, my dignity, my connection to my family. The photograph he forced me to take wearing that white dress was the worst day. He wanted to pretend I was his wife, that I had chosen to be there. But I made sure to leave a message in that picture. I moved my fingers just so, a distress signal I had read about in a book. I didn't know if anyone would ever see it, but I needed to try. I needed there to be some evidence that I hadn't gone willingly." The records showed that Catherine had helped Louisa intact her family through carefully coded messages to avoid alerting Whitfield. In May 1904, Louisa's mother, Martha, received a letter. "Mama, I am alive. I cannot tell you where I am, only that I am safe now and healing. The man who held me believes I am dead. Please let him continue to believe that. It is the only way to keep you and father and my siblings safe. I will write again when I can. I love you, your daughter." Marcus found the final piece of the puzzle in Atlanta newspaper archives from March 1904. A small article reported, "Fire at Whitfield residence claims life. Authorities report that a tragic fire occurred at the home of prominent businessman Charles Whitfield last evening. One servant perished in the blaze. Mr. Whitfield stated that the young Negro woman, whose name was not recorded, had been careless with cooking fire. The body was too badly burned for identification. The incident is considered a tragic accident, but a black newspaper, the Atlanta Independent, told a different story in a carefully worded article. Sources within the Negro community report that the servant, who allegedly died in the recent fire at the Whitfield home, had in fact escaped weeks earlier. Several witnesses report seeing a young woman matching her description, fleeing the property in February. The fire appears to have been deliberately set to obscure the fact of her escape and to intimidate other potential witnesses. Police have declined to investigate further. Louisa had escaped and Whitfield had covered it up by claiming she died in a fire. He couldn't admit she had gotten away without revealing the truth of her captivity. He had to maintain his facade of respectability. so he created a fictional death and moved on. For the Johnson family, this meant they could never publicly acknowledge their daughter was alive without putting her in danger. Rebecca and Marcus found letters between Martha Johnson and Catherine Wells, spanning years. Catherine had helped Louisa build a new life in Washington, D.C. under an assumed name. She found work as a seamstress and later trained as a nurse. She married a kind man named Edward, a postal worker, in 1908. They had 4 children, but Louisa never returned to Atlanta, and her parents had to pretend their daughter was dead to protect her. Marcus discovered that Louisa kept the story alive in her own way. In 1925, she gave testimony to a commission investigating racial violence and exploitation in the South. She didn't use her real name, but she told her story. "I was 19 when a white man took me from my family and held me captive for 8 months. He could do this because the law didn't protect people who looked like me. He knew no one would believe me if I spoke. He knew my family had no power to save me. But I survived. And I want my story on record so that someday when the world is ready to hear it, people will know what happened to women like me." Rebecca and Marcus spent 6 months compiling their research into a comprehensive historical documentation. They traced Louisa's descendants through Washington, D.C. records and found her great-granddaughter, a woman named Dr. Michelle Foster, who taught African American history at Howard University. When Rebecca called her, Michelle's response was immediate and emotional. "We had been waiting for someone to find this story." They met at Michelle's home where she had preserved everything Louisa had left behind. "My great-grandmother lived until 1978, Michelle explained. She was 94 years old, and she never forgot what happened in Atlanta. She told us the story when we were old enough to understand. She made us promise to preserve it, to make sure it wasn't forgotten. She said, 'Someday, someone will find that photograph, and when they do, I want them to know the whole truth.'" Michelle showed them Louisa's personal papers, including a journal she had kept in her later years. One entry read, "I have lived a good life in spite of what was done to me. I raised 4 beautiful children. I helped bring dozens of babies into the world as a nurse. I loved and was loved, but I never forgot those 8 months, and I never forgot my parents' anguish. That photograph exists somewhere with my silent scream frozen in it. I pray that one day someone will see it and understand. I pray that my story will help people recognize how many women suffered in silence, trapped by laws that denied our humanity in a society that refused to see our pain." The National Museum of African American History and Culture organized an exhibition titled Silent Testimony: Louisa's Story and the Hidden History of Jim Crow Captivity. The centerpiece was the 1903 photograph displayed alongside the photographer's journal, hospital records, family letters, and Louisa's own testimony. The exhibition text was unflinching. "This photograph documents not a marriage but a crime. It shows a young black woman being held captive by a white man who faced no consequences. Because the legal and social systems of Jim Crow America granted him absolute impunity." At the opening, Michelle stood before the photograph with tears streaming down her face. Beside the 1903 image was a photo of Louisa from 1960, age 76, surrounded by children and grandchildren, her face serene and strong. "My great-grandmother survived," Michelle said to the assembled crowd. "She not only survived, she transcended. She turned her trauma into purpose, helping other women, raising a family, building a life of meaning." This photograph no longer represents just her captivity. It represents her resistance, her courage, and her refusal to be erased. Rebecca addressed the audience. "For 120 years, Louisa's distress signal went unnoticed, but she left it there anyway, trusting that someday someone would look closely enough to see. Her story is not just about one woman's suffering. It's about the systematic abuse enabled by racist laws and social structures. It's about the countless black and women who were similarly victimized with no recourse. And it's about the extraordinary resilience of those who survived and built lives of dignity despite everything designed to destroy them." As thousands of visitors moved through the exhibition over the following months, they saw Louisa's hand signal, read her story, and understood the truth that had been hidden for more than a century. The photograph had finally fulfilled its purpose, not as evidence that could save Louisa in her own time, but as a testament that refused to let her story be forgotten. Her silent scream had finally been heard. And in being heard, it gave voice to countless others whose stories had been buried by history's deliberate amnesia.